Imagine this. You're standing in the heart of ancient Rome, 67 AD. The sun beats down on marble statues, and the air is thick with incense and gossip. Suddenly, heads turn. Emperor Nero himself walks through the forum, arm in arm with a woman shimmering in silks and jewels. She looks regal, untouchable, but people stare not in awe, in horror, because everyone knows that woman was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to him? It may be one of the most disturbing examples of manipulation and cruelty the Roman Empire ever produced. This isn't just another scandal of Roman depravity. This is the story of how power twisted love into obsession, turned grief into madness sectorial, and transformed a teenage boy into a living doll. A human puppet carved to replace the one person Nero couldn't let go. Sporus's name has nearly vanished from history books, but after today, you'll never forget it. Before we dive into this nightmare, just think about how wild this is. Across time, across continents, you're here, listening to a story buried for 2,000 years, one so chilling it still echoes. And it all begins not with Sporus, but with the man who would destroy him, Nero. Nero didn't start out a monster. At 16, he looked like the fresh hope of the Roman Empire. He slashed taxes, funded games, took to the stage himself, entertaining crowds with song and drama. The people adored him. But power, real, unchecked power, doesn't just corrupt. It consumes. By 65 AD, Nero wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was paranoid, volatile, trapped in a bubble where no one could say no to him, where every smile might hide betrayal, where being emperor meant being utterly, terrifyingly alone. And into that darkness stepped one person who could light him up like no one else, Poppaea Sabina. She wasn't just stunning, she was sharp, political, dangerous. Unlike Nero's first wife, Octavia, a cold, silent product of a political alliance, Poppaea knew how to own a room. She sparkled where Octavia faded. She commanded where others obeyed. And Nero? He didn't just love her. He obsessed over her. It started as a scandalous affair, one of many in Rome's blood-soaked elite. But this one spiraled. Nero lost himself in her. He couldn't stand other men looking at her. Couldn't bear the idea of her talking to anyone without him knowing. He filled her world with luxury. Gems from India, silks from the East, perfumes worth entire fortunes. But these weren't gifts. They were chains. Nero's obsession hit terrifying new levels. He wasn't just jealous, he was possessive. Guards shadowed Poppaea day and night, not to protect her, but to report her every move. And while Rome crumbled under financial strain, Nero bled the treasury dry, just to keep her surrounded by beauty. But he didn't stop there. He divorced Octavia, a move that scandalized the Senate. Then he staged the most lavish wedding Rome had ever seen. Poppaea arrived in gold-threaded robes, musicians played into the night, and Nero? He looked like a man who had conquered the gods. But love wasn't enough. He wanted her to belong to him. Entirely. He cut her off from family. From friends. From anyone who might remind her that she once had a life outside of Nero. He filled entire chambers with her portraits. Hundreds of paintings, sculptures, even wax figures. And when she moved through the palace, he watched. For hours. Silently. Not with affection, but hunger, like a collector admiring his most prized object. Poppaea knew the game she was playing. She used her beauty like armor, building alliances, protecting her position, carefully manipulating the man who both adored her and terrified her. But she made one fatal mistake. She didn't fear him enough. Where others bowed, she spoke back. Where others flattered, she challenged. She mocked his poetry, laughed at his singing, questioned his decisions, as if she'd forgotten who she was dealing with. She was pregnant again, carrying what might have been the heir to the empire. But that didn't stop her from confronting Nero when he returned late from chariot races. That night, no one knows exactly what triggered it. Some say she mocked his voice, others say she accused him of caring more about his image than his unborn child of Sporus. But what happened next, no one doubts. In a blinding rage, Nero struck her. Some say he kicked her. Others claim he beat her until she collapsed. She was pregnant, fragile, and bleeding. By the time the horror settled in, it was too late. She was gone. The woman he had idolized, controlled, destroyed, lay lifeless on the palace floor. And in that moment, the Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, crumbled. Nero collapsed over her body, begging forgiveness one moment, screaming commands the next. He ordered physicians to save her, promised them riches, then threatened them with torture. None of it mattered. Poppaea and her unborn child were dead. Something inside Nero shattered. He refused to cremate her, a sacred Roman tradition. Instead, he had her embalmed, entombed in splendor, and declared her a goddess. He built a cult in her name, talked to her corpse, held dinners in her honor where courtiers had to speak about her as if she was still alive. Her favorite seat left untouched. Her name whispered in present tense. To suggest the emperor move on was a death sentence. Rome tiptoed around his madness. But in this haze of grief and delusion, Nero saw something. Someone, a teenage boy, barely 14 or 15, raised inside the imperial palace, a former slave, now freed. His name was Sporus. He was educated, trained for service, disciplined, but that's not what caught Nero's attention. It was his face, his eyes, the uncanny resemblance to Poppaea. Soft features, high cheekbones, the same haunted expression. In Rome, people believed physical likeness meant something deeper, a kind of spiritual echo. And Nero? He saw a chance to undo the past. The resemblance hit him like lightning. It didn't matter that Sporus was male. Nero had convinced himself he was a god. He'd talked to a corpse for months. Changing someone's gender? That was nothing. What happened next wasn't madness. It was cold, deliberate. A decision made not in grief, but in complete detachment from reality. Nero didn't just tell Sporus to dress like a woman, he ordered the imperial doctors, the finest surgeons in Rome, to change him. This wasn't a transformation, it was mutilation, a brutal, irreversible surgery, carried out in secret chambers deep within the palace. Sporus was dragged into a world he never chose. A world of scalpels, restraints, and silent screams. Ancient Roman medicine was primitive. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, just heat, blades, and pain. He was likely held down by guards, his limbs bound, while physicians cut into him, not to heal, but to erase. He survived, but barely. The pain would have lasted for weeks. Infections were common, bleeding was endless. There were no soft words, no gentle recoveries. Just long, sleepless nights in a blood-stained bed, wondering what he was now, and what came next. And what came next was a wedding. Yes, a wedding. Not a quiet ceremony, not a personal moment. Nero announced with full imperial fanfare that he would take this surgically altered teenage boy, now renamed Sabina, in honor of the dead Poppaea, as his wife. Preparations took months. Tailors and stylists were summoned from across the empire. Silks imported from the east were stitched into gowns meant to flatter Sporus's reshaped body, to hide the masculine lines that hadn't yet faded. Jewelry, once worn by Poppaea herself, was polished and repurposed. Earrings, bracelets, and necklaces, relics of the dead, now offered like trophies to her replacement. But the transformation wasn't just physical. They trained him. Every single day. Cosmetic tutors showed him how to line his eyes with kohl, how to dust rouge on his cheeks to mimic that healthy feminine glow. They bleached his skin, powdered his face, taught him to soften his angles, to erase every trace of the boy he once was. Hairdressers styled his curls into elaborate Roman fashions, layers of pins, ribbons, and ornaments twisted into impossible shapes. Each session lasted hours, requiring boiling irons and steady hands. And every day, Sporus sat in silence, letting it happen. But the worst part wasn't the makeup, or the dresses, or even the surgery. It was the performance. Nero assigned Sporus a team of tutors, not to educate, but to erase. They taught him how to walk like a woman. Not just walk, glide. He had to hold his wrists just so, point his toes when seated, lower his gaze with fake humility. They showed him how to fold his garments, how to adjust his veil, how to rise from a couch without disturbing the pleats of his dress. Everything was about grace, delicacy, submission. Even his voice wasn't spared. Speech coaches drilled him daily, raising his pitch, softening his tone, reshaping how he breathed. Roman women weren't supposed to speak boldly. They cooed. They whispered. And Sporus had to become that, not for a day, not for a disguise, forever. Can you imagine that? Every word monitored, every gesture corrected. And every time he passed a mirror, he saw not himself, but the ghost of a woman he had never even met. A face covered in powders and paint. A stranger staring back. Every bracelet he wore had once belonged to Poppaea. Every gown had been made to fit her body, and now forced to fit his. He wasn't being dressed. He was being buried. Then came the wedding. Spring, 67 AD. Rome bloomed with flowers and ceremonial fire. But inside the imperial palace, something grotesque was unfolding. Nero spared no expense. The hall was lit with thousands of oil lamps. Petals were scattered across polished marble floors. The air reeked of perfume and expectation. Sporus, or rather Sabina, stood in full bridal regalia, surrounded by servants who didn't dare meet his eyes. Musicians played traditional wedding hymns. The Emperor of Rome took his hand, and the crowd watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the world married a teenage boy in the name of a dead woman. The ritual followed every Roman tradition. Vows were exchanged, hands were joined, bread was broken, scrolls were signed, and when it ended, the guests clapped it because they had to. They smiled, because not smiling could mean exile or death. But behind the masks, the truth hung in the air like smoke. They all knew what they had just witnessed, and none of them would ever forget it. After the wedding, Sporus didn't just become a shadow of the dead empress. He became her official replacement. Nero granted him private quarters, a personal household staff, a gilded litter, elite horses, and a generous allowance from the imperial treasury. Everything once reserved for the emperor's wife was now handed to a teenage boy who had no say in the matter. But beneath all that luxury was absolute control. Sporus was required to accompany Nero to every public event, sit beside him at imperial banquets, appear at festivals, and play the role of the devoted, submissive, adoring wife. It wasn't just a performance, it was his new reality. And playing along was the only way to survive. Nero treated him as if he truly were Poppaea. He called him by her name, spoke of shared memories, never happened, and expected Sporus to respond as if he had lived those moments. Each conversation became a test. Stay silent, and you look suspicious. Respond incorrectly, and it could mean death. According to ancient sources, Sporus eventually mastered this deadly theatre. He learned to read Nero's moods from the slightest shift in his expression. When to laugh, when to sympathize, when to act moved. His performance was flawless, because failure wasn't an option. His life depended on it. But behind the perfect act was a growing void. Sporus became increasingly withdrawn, somber, and hollow. Every morning he woke in rooms adorned with portraits of the woman he had been forced to replace, a stranger whose identity now smothered his own. And every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not himself, but the echo of someone else's obsession. In every conversation, he wasn't just pretending to be a woman. He had to become one who had lived, loved, and died, and now stared back at him from paintings above his bed. His body, his voice, his movements, his name, all had been rewritten. And there was no way back. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this grotesque fiction, day after day, playing a role he never chose. But his torment was far from over. In 67 AD, Nero decided to leave Rome for a grand tour of Greece, determined to prove himself not just as an emperor, but as an artist, a poet, a god of culture. And naturally, Sporus, now the empress, was brought along for the ride. Everywhere they went, Nero demanded admiration. He performed on stage, recited poetry, played the lyre, and forced audiences to applaud. Sporus was displayed beside him at every event, dressed in shimmering gowns, sitting quietly like a painted doll, always smiling, always watching. Foreign dignitaries stared in disbelief. Here was the conqueror of the world, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a dead woman, and expecting everyone to pretend it was normal. But the empire had reached its breaking point. While Nero competed in Greek festivals, Rome fell into chaos. His neglect of politics, the collapsing economy, the cruelty, the extravagance, it all became too much. Rebellions erupted. Roman governors declared open defiance. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, turned against him. The Senate branded him a public enemy. Nero fled the city with a small group of loyalists, and among them, still playing the role assigned to him, still wearing someone else's identity like a mask, was Sporus. They fled in silence, riding through the outskirts of Rome while the empire they ruled turned against them. Nero, once adored by the masses, now hid in a countryside villa, pacing between fits of delusion and despair. He made plans to escape to Egypt, then changed his mind. He composed final songs, practiced his death scene like a performance, but the noose of history was tightening. Sporus was there the entire time, still dressed in silk, still answering to the name of a woman who no longer existed. Even as Nero panicked, even as loyalists slipped away, Sporus remained. The final reflection of a life the emperor couldn't let go. When news arrived that soldiers were closing in, Nero finally made his choice. He couldn't face humiliation. He took his own life with the help of a servant, and with him, the empire's grotesque illusion shattered. But for Sporus, it was only the beginning of a new nightmare. With Nero gone, Sporus was no longer a person. He was a symbol, and a problem. A living remnant of the emperor's madness. He was claimed by powerful men, passed between them like an exotic possession. First Nymphidius Sabinus, then Otho, then Vitellius. Each treated him not as Sporus, but as Poppaea. They dressed him as a woman, called him Sabina, forced him to maintain the illusion Nero had created, long after Nero was dead. And then came the final insult. Emperor Vitellius, known for cruelty masked as entertainment, decided Sporus would be the centerpiece in a public spectacle at the Colosseum. Not a ceremony, not a farewell, a performance. He would be paraded before the Roman masses and raped as part of a twisted reenactment of myth, a living prop in the empire's blood-soaked theatre. Sporus understood what that meant. For years, his identity had been stripped from him piece by piece, his body altered, his mind broken, his name erased. But this final humiliation would destroy even the fragments that remained. So he made the only decision that was truly his. He chose death, most likely by poison. He was barely 20 years old. From the moment Nero looked into Sporus's face and saw Poppaea, the boy was no longer seen as a person. He became a mirror, a vessel, a blank canvas for the ideas, for the fantasies of a grieving tyrant. His voice, his name, his future, all of it rewritten to serve someone else's illusion. And yet, in the end, something inside him survived. The fact that Sporus chose death, rather than endure one more moment of humiliation, tells us something vital. Beneath the layers of silk and powder, beneath the enforced voice and borrowed name, a spark of his original self remained. His suicide wasn't surrender, it was rebellion. A final furious act of selfhood, the one thing they could never fully take from him. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is this. We know almost nothing about the boy he once was. What did he dream about before the palace doors closed behind him? Did he ever hope for love? For freedom? That version of Sporus, the real one, was erased. Replaced by a performance so complete, his true identity vanished behind the role of a woman he had never met. He was a child turned into an empress, reshaped by violence, paraded for power, and finally discarded. But his story is not just a grotesque footnote in the history of Rome. It's a reminder that behind every statue, every crown, every glorious empire, there are people like Sporus, silenced, shattered, but still human, still worthy of remembrance. By choosing death, he reclaimed the one freedom denied to him his entire life, the right to decide his own fate. And in that final moment, he reminded us of something emperors often forget, that even the smallest, most powerless voice can speak the loudest when it says no.